Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Certification course. Everyone can be seated. Hope everybody's warmer in the building than outside. Texas weather, they promise 65 and give you 35, so that's what it's like out here. But welcome to everyone that's watching overseas. I know we have people watching in Lagos, Nigeria, that it's always 70 or 80 degrees. The same thing down in Trinidad. So you have to come join us one day and see what it's like to be very cold. It's something to experience, but I don't know about enjoy, but experience. But if you'll be turning in your acceptance unit, and once again, we're in the acceptance unit. That's the second of 5, a series of 5 in the junior high series. The first one being the character unit, the second one being the acceptance unit, and we're building up to the self-control unit. And once again, if you haven't already gotten a copy of the Teacher's Manual Self-Control, I would be getting one fairly quickly. We probably have a couple more classes in the acceptance unit, and then we'll be moving on to the self-control, because we're pretty close to finishing up the acceptance right now. We left off on page 145, so if you could be turning over to 145 and put your finger there, because we're going to go back and reread our procedures that we started in, which was procedure 7 for page 145. And the procedure is found on LP7D. So LP7D. And of course, that's why it's so important to get a teacher's manual. If you're not familiar with what the difference between the teacher's manual and the student manual is, the teacher's manual has all the lesson plans. And it also has the answers italicized. It gives helpful hints in the lesson plans themselves, building off the previous lessons. So it's very teacher-friendly in helping the class go along, especially for teachers that teach more than one subject, and you have to prepare many things in advance. The Peaceful Solution, the way the lesson plans are put together, the teacher just needs to go over them before the class, and the continuity of the class will flow. And of course, the students themselves will always have much to say in how they're experiencing certain things in their lives. And needless to say, with generations as they go from one to the next, experiences change drastically. Technology has changed drastically. Society in itself, I think we can say in the last 2 years, has changed drastically from what we're used to or what society says we're used to. Everybody wants to go back to the life the way it was. But I honestly, and I'm not trying to be a critic, but I wasn't too fond of life the way it was to begin with. The crime, the death, the suicides, the drug abuse, the overdoses, the things that are taking place in many different countries that are not beneficial to mankind in general, whether it be a man, woman, or child. I think there's a lot of work to be done, and we can never be content with saying, well, we'll be satisfied just going back to the way it was before COVID. The way it was before COVID was pretty bad as far as morality goes. So don't set your goals so low, you know. There's nothing wrong with making realistic goals, but there's no use to get crazy about it and say, well, we'll just go back to what we came from, and that'll be okay. It wasn't okay to begin with, you know, and well, how can you say that? Well, we brought forth COVID out of the way we were living, right? So, and they still haven't figured out really how that come about. So, you know, we need to evaluate that and remember what we've talked about so far. David hit on it pretty well with information in his classes. William and Canton have expounded upon about how these diseases that we find in our life, especially for children at a young age, a lot of them can start, and as I encouraged everyone last week, get with an adult, get with a guardian, a teacher, and look up what STDs do to the body, especially when you get them as a young person and you think that, well, I got a shot for it and it went away. Read it out. Don't take our words for it. Research it, and you'll find that these things hibernate in the body. They stay there, and they eventually resurface as many other very harsh diseases, whether it be heart disease, cancers. You know, there was a huge thing that took place when a president, George W. Bush, he set a new guideline of education concerning abstinence, and it led to a certain behavior. And you can look that up to find out what I'm talking about. But the abstinence, teenagers decided that, well, this will get me around that and I can still do what I want to do. And it led to an enormous amount of HPV in the mouth, throat cancer taking place. And of course, what did society do? Well, they came out with the HPV vaccine. That doesn't stop someone from making a bad choice. You know, if someone says, well, people are running stop signs, well, let's come up with a stop sign vaccine. You know, we'll give it to you. And when you run the stop sign, I'm not sure how it's supposed to help you when you break the rules. You know, and whether it's intentional or unintentional, if you break the rules, you might go through that stop sign and nothing take place, but you keep running that stop sign, eventually something really bad is going to take place. Especially out here in Texas when the speed limit's pretty much 75 mile an hour anywhere, you know, out in the country, outside the city, people are not used to, if you don't live in Texas and you're used to driving on the interstate, well, that's normal speed in Texas on the back roads. That's the speed limit. So, you know, you run enough stop signs and you don't get an opportunity to run another one. It ends pretty bad. But here on LP7D, remembering about our choices, and that's what we want to think about. We've talked about our purpose, determining our purpose and reaching for our goals. And now we're expounding more about this right choice. And here in Procedure 7, it says, emphasize, so that's the teacher needs to really stress this, that exercising self-control and considering the consequences of their actions will enable them to make wise choices. Well, what exactly are we saying there? You know, make sure that you control yourself. You know, don't jump out of your seat and get excited if something takes place and you're all joyful, right? Or when the judge says, I want the courtroom quiet as I read the sentencing here, and I don't want to hear anybody, and of course they read the sentencing and somebody goes, oh, that wasn't self-control. No, it's much deeper than that. It's much, much deeper. And that's one thing that, just to scratch the surface, is controlling, as we went back to the character unit, controlling the way you think, feel, and act, but of course knowing that your decisions affect yourself, someone else, and the environment. And the word self-control, of course, it means, you know, control yourself, but there's so much more to it than controlling your hands. You know, controlling your mouth can be a very challenging thing to do. Controlling your thoughts can be another very challenging thing to do. But when we work at it, it's possible to, whatever we're processing in our mind, to consider the outcome of what will take place if we let it come out of our mouths, and that will help us control what comes out of our mouths. And if you're a teacher in a classroom, I have no doubt you understand what I mean by students not controlling what comes out of their mouths. I know I've been teaching with the same group of men for years, and as we were going into the schools back in the mid-2000s, going all the way up into today, we've seen the student body, no matter what city we went to, whether it would be in Texas, Arkansas, any other country that, or countries or cities that we've been in. United States tended to be worse from this experience that I'm getting ready to tell you about, but the way that students talk to their teachers is mind-blowing. It's astounding. And sadly, the teachers feel that they have to accept the way they're treated, and teachers are just quitting. To the point when we were in Houston one time, a teacher told us that, as a guidance counselor actually, that if a teacher can last at least 4 years, usually they can get it set in their mind in the school system, the public school system, they can hang in there, but they're going to be abused. So they accept that they're going to be abused and talked to in a very vulgar way. And we heard some very vulgar words spoken to teachers that I never heard when I was in school. Not one time did I ever hear anything like that. But we've been to schools lately, it seemed like normal conversation. It's just the way they talk to the teachers. But of course, this conduct that's going on, they said most teachers are quitting in less than 4 years. So they actually go to college for a job, and they go to college more than they actually perform the job due to the abuse. And this self-control can be very helpful in any situation. And, you know, I always challenge teachers if they say, my class is beyond fixing. my class is beyond repair, then, we always tell them, you have the perfect class for this program. You haven't had the program to fix it yet. Now we're telling you, if you will teach us exactly how we have instructed, you will see results. And one of the first things that politicians want to do is, well, let us see your study. I had a politician tell myself and William that one time in Washington, D.C., and I couldn't help but look back and say, well, I think the study from what you're doing so far expounds and kind of shows that it's not working. So you have to accept the fact what you're doing is broken. That's your study, is what it showed you so far. If you want to study, implement it. Put it to work in your life. I would rather see a change in my society, my student body, the community I live in, than for someone from an Ivy League college tell me that this plus this plus this will work in this kind of environment. I would rather see it go to work in my own life and see it work in others' life and see people benefit from it. A real study, something they talk about this reality TV. Well, this is reality education. This is reality of making things better. It's not fictional. It actually will make a person's life better. And we have seen many, many testimonials and heard of many testimonials. And I hope to put some up here soon of what took place with some young people in a foreign country, and how a very poor country that found a lot of money, and they made the right choice and returned it when they could have kept it. And all because of this program of what they've been taking. But once again, the self-control and the consequences of a person's actions. So here back in LP 7D, it says, have students read the section entitled Make a Right Choice on page 145 in their handbooks. Emphasize that a right choice is worth the effort, regardless of how they are viewed by their peers. They can have the satisfaction of making a choice that will keep themselves and others safe. And, sometimes, sadly, the desire to have the satisfaction of keeping others safe doesn't come until someone is injured or dies. Just as in the story we read about the young girl who took the ecstasy and ended up dying. All the student body, they passed out ribbons, and they did this and they did that. Then why did they pass out ribbons? It's supposed to remind you of what drugs do. I would think the death probably should remind you of what drugs do. But the ribbon there, I guess, is to remind you of what the drugs did and how it brought forth the death. If we have to go through society continually passing out memorials for people that make bad choices, if we have to keep building things to remind people this is why these people died, we've got memorials all over the world, and it hasn't stopped things. We have a wall in Washington, D.C. that represents a lot of people that died in Vietnam. We have walls in Israel that represents a lot of the Jews that died in the Holocaust. You can go to many countries and see many names on a wall, but they're just names on a wall. Their stories are never told. The agony they go through is never spoken of. But the change that we need to make in making this right choice is right before our very eyes, and it's right at the end of our fingertips. And this is what we're wanting to, when I say emphasize, this is what I'm talking about. Get your students' minds, get their wheels turning. I'm not saying that passing out ribbons doesn't help in an instance. I'm just saying there has to be more done. Education and helping people before the person dies. As we said last class, it would be nice if when you go to make a choice, you could stop and see the final outcome of what your choice will do. That's actually attainable if we'll stop and consider it. Now, obviously, not in every situation, because there's obstacles that will arise, and sometimes we have to navigate ourselves through many decisions in making the right choice. And sometimes making the right choice is not always so clear. But when we take the time to process these things with self-control, it becomes more clear. It's kind of like when you get out of the shower and the steam is all over the mirror, and you take your towel and you start wiping it off so it will clear up so you can see it. and then all of a sudden the moisture starts leaving and it starts clearing up. That's kind of the same way that the self-control and the processing of the thoughts and the speech and the actions, you're wiping away that fog that kind of makes it hard to see what is the right choice. And the more that it's done, the easier it becomes in doing that. But without taking the time to do it, you never get the full picture. You never get to see what you want to see. So here it says, have students complete the goals worksheet on page 146 in their handbooks and remind them that achieving their goals requires staying focused and making the right choice. So let's turn over to page 145 with a section entitled Make a Right Choice. And once again, remember, young lady that we read about there that took the ecstasy, said she was a great student. She talked to her mom about drugs. Sounds like she had her life in line. And then somebody gave her this gift. Some friends gave her a gift of something. Poison pretty much is what it was. And she took it. And it ended her life. And she broke it in half. Didn't even take the whole thing at once. Tried to, be very, cautious with it by breaking it in half and hoping she would get the euphoria, as it said. But she didn't get it, so she took the other half. And it led to her dying. Well, once again, let's start from the very top. We left off after reading the first paragraph, but we're going to stop from the very top once again. And it says, whenever you are faced with a choice, and every day you're faced with choices, and try to, and I'm not saying, stop what you're doing during the day, but try to start marking down how many times you're faced with choices that give you some difficulty. Not easy choices, but choices that give you some difficulty in achieving. And just mark down how many times a day you go through that. And you'll start seeing that, sometimes our wheels, they're trying to turn, but they get stuck because we're not seeing the picture very clearly. And sometimes we honestly just don't know which way to go. And there's nothing wrong, as we said before, just ask. Find someone you can trust and ask someone. Ask for guidance. Ask for help. Every one of us need it. There's not a person on the face of this earth that doesn't need help or guidance at one time in their life or another, or at 50 times in their life or 1,000 times in their life. Every day people can use guidance. And that's why friends are so important. But once again here, whenever you are faced with a choice, consider the consequences of your actions. Consider the goals that you have set for yourself. And then make a decision that will not, once again, bring harm to yourself, bring harm to others, jeopardize your positive goals, and then, of course, risk your life. None of those things are worth experimenting with. It's not worth it. If you work hard and you do something foolish to cost you your life, well, you worked a long time for nothing. You haven't accomplished anything. And I heard when I was growing up, a lady told me one time, she said, only the good die young. And I thought, well, what sense does that make? That's the same person that told me never say never, and I still haven't figured that one out yet. It kind of doesn't make sense. So you won't never say never. Okay. Well, I guess that means I can't set my mind to do the right thing. Never say that you won't do it. It's kind of very misleading. It's a statement that kind of opens the door to do something that you normally wouldn't do. But of course, remember that right and wrong, as we talked about there on the character unit in page 8, where we talked about the morality in society and how to define morality, and how we talk about it brings no harm to yourself, someone else, or the environment. Now, once again, bringing harm doesn't mean, bodily injury. You could talk about, hurting people, whether it be physically or emotionally. There's some things that you can say to someone. And I would think most people can relate that when someone has done something and a person becomes upset at what someone has done, the situation, they allow themselves to become angry. The one thing that people want to do is let that person know how displeased they are with them through tone of voice, through the words that they say. And, remember, every time a situation arises and the anger is boiling inside and we haven't got to the part when no one makes you angry, but we'll get there. So just keep this in mind, that whenever you go to a situation and you're faced with this choice, and we just talked about not bringing harm to yourself or others, well, think about the workplace or the school environment. And if all you want to do is say something back to an individual to let them know how much you're displeased with them in a very negative, nasty type of way, it's no different than taking gasoline and throwing it on a fire. It doesn't help the situation at all. So one thing that we could use to practice self-control of what we were talking about in the lesson plan is before you go and say something to someone, consider the effects that it will have on the situation, and does it solve the problem or does it cause the problem to become bigger? That's an evaluation that a person needs to do in their mind. Could go get some advice from a trusted person, whether it be a guidance counselor, a teacher, a guardian, or so forth. But consider what it is before we say it. As we gave the example many times before with the notebook paper, the aluminum foil, and you wad it up, and it's like bad words that are spoken, and you throw it out to a student and try to get them to get all the wrinkles back out, you can never return it back to what it was. And once these things are spoken, and sometimes we could have had the opportunity, if we had only have said the right words, chosen the right words, used self-control in our speech, making the right choice, we could have de-escalated many situations that we escalated, that we brought, like blazing fires, like the whole countryside takes off. Well, it's hard to look in society for examples of how to use self-control. It's hard to say that countries have self-control, and challenge your students with this. How much self-control is involved in dropping bombs on other people? Is that the right choice? Is it the right choice that everyone has a nuclear bomb so we'll feel safe? Imagine, and challenge your students with this. Obviously, you can't do this in a school. I'm not encouraging anyone to point a gun at somebody, but an analogy. Imagine that the student has a very high-powered gun pointing at you, and you have a high-powered gun pointing at him or her. Is that supposed to make you feel safe since both of you have a gun? That'll keep you both in check? Wouldn't life be a lot better if no one had any kind of dangerous weapon pointing at the other one? Wouldn't that bring more peace? Well, yeah, you're right, it would. And that's what the peaceful solution teaches. And sometimes the tongues in our mouth can be more dangerous than a gun or a knife or any kind of weapon, because those words are what lead to the thoughts that lead to the actions of committing the really sad situations that come forth from shootings, stabbings, bombings. These things are all processed. There's more to dropping a bomb on a country than pushing a button. There's a thought process and a chain of command that takes place, but there's also a thought process and a chain of command that takes place within the individual that issues it from his mouth, who tells the next person. So think about these things, and why is society so much safer if everybody has a gun pointing at everybody else? It's not. That doesn't even make sense. It's insanity to think that as long as we all have a gun and the person has the bigger gun, that's the right choice. And whatever you can think of in your local communities, in your countries, challenge your students to come up with scenarios of what, challenge. Is this really the right choice? If it's the right choice, your country should be moving toward peace. You should be eliminating theft, eliminating disease. You should be eliminating anything that's detrimental to your country. If you're still having these problems, then obviously there's still issues, no matter what country you're in. And it's always easier to look to the other countries and go, yeah, but we're not the worst country. We're like the third worst. There's two worse than us. Go fix them and then come back and talk to us. Well, if you were going to start with a country and start, hey, these nuclear bombs can affect everyone. You know that, right? From the nicest country to the worst country. And, well, who do you talk to first? Do you start with Russia or China or France or the UK or the United States? Do you talk with India? Do you talk with Pakistan? Do you talk with Israel, who doesn't even acknowledge they have one, but they threaten to nuke people continually? Who do you talk to? Who do you talk to in getting this right choice made? Well, why does that global scale affect a child's mind? That's what they're seeing every day. That's the experiences they're getting. And whether we realize it or not, as I know William went into this about the subconscious mind, we feed the subconscious mind every day with information, and we process decisions off of that. And if we're going to allow someone to convince us that bringing harm to yourself, whether we like it or not, if you drop a nuclear bomb on another country, it's a scientific fact, you will also suffer. It's called nuclear fallout. You know, it amounts to, I would say that a person would hate someone so much, I think I'm going to shoot them. And you just stick your hand right there in front of the gun and you shoot through your hand and then shoot them. That's about how much sense it makes. It's complete insanity. And once again, if you're bringing harm to yourself or bringing harm to others, it doesn't make sense to do it. It's not the right choice. But once again, challenge your students. Continuing on here on page 145, it says, a right choice is a choice, notice, that causes no harm to yourself or others. And once again, that could be through physical, even emotional. You know, let's consider how to do things. There's a lot of times we can solve problems without hurting people, whether it be physically or emotionally. It takes into consideration the consequences of your actions. So once again, making the right choice, it takes into consideration the consequences of your actions. That means you have insight. You know, you're giving forethought to it. You're thinking, if I do this, what will take place here? And I've heard people, especially young people, that go, I just don't see how to do that. Then obviously they don't know how to cook. Because when you cook a meal, you consider what you're putting into it and the consequences if you put too much salt, too much pepper, not enough sugar, you know, all the great things. Sugar, you know, that's a really great thing. Very healthy. You should research that. Helps the body, helps the mind. Pure sugar. When you get into these things, they actually help and they build the body. Well, the consequences of our actions, if we, you know, and I've done this before. I've made tea, and then I go to taste it, and it's horrible. Like, what did I do? Well, I forgot to put sugar in. I learned very quickly I like tea better with sugar, me personally. These things actually help us to build our character when we consider if I say something negative to my teacher, well, for one, in today's society, sadly, the teacher's probably just going to have to tolerate it. Wasn't that way always. And it doesn't have to be that way to all the teachers that are listening. It doesn't have to be that way. Teachers do not have to be punching bags, and they don't have to take abuse. You know, the consequences of an action, if the school rules say that if you do this, you will be sent to the principal's office and your parents will be called. If that's a rule, and you never keep the rule yourself, then you're kind of adding to the breaking of the rules. But once again, taking into consideration the consequences of your actions. If your friends don't respect your decisions to make the right choice, then consider whether they are really behaving as true friends. Remember, a friend is someone who respects you and allows you to be an individual. Very quickly, turn back over and remind your students on page 62 what a true friend is and what we talked about with friendships. And of course, on page 62, it says who is a friend. A friend is one, notice, who supports, respects, encourages, and accepts you as a unique individual. Friends can come in all shapes and sizes and from all walks of life. Friends can come from all nationalities and ethnicities. It's important to not cut yourself off from getting to know someone because they are different. You know, don't cloud your mind. And we've already covered in the acceptance unit. If someone teaches you in this making a right choice, and we're talking about friendships, if someone teaches you that your friend should be based on the color of their skin, that's not a friend. If someone teaches you that a friend should be based on nationality, that's not a friend. You know, I always laugh at people that make the comment that the United States is for Americans, and only Americans should be here. Well, we probably need to leave then, since we're mostly European. We kind of came over here many generations ago and infringed on some people's land. We say things without really educating ourselves. It's kind of like standing down at the border on the American side and say, I don't know why Mexicans cross that border and come into our country. We stole it fair and square. And you think about these things and it's like, there's no wonder we have enemies. And it's not just the United States. I'm not trying to condemn the United States in any which shape or form. Ukraine saying the same thing about Crimea right now. You have North and South Korea that are always high tensions, and they divided their country and called it North and South. It wasn't always North and South Korea. It used to be the Korean Peninsula. Now there's a North and a South to it. And there's other countries, Southern Sudan, countries that divided themselves because of war. But dividing themselves did not fix the problem. They didn't become true friends. But once again here, notice the choosing friends. The importance of choosing positive friends cannot be overstated. Never forget that. It cannot be overstated. Why can it not be overstated? And why does it go in line with, remember, never underestimate the power of an influence? Throughout the day, who usually influences you the most in your interaction? It's going to be your friends, the ones you hang around, the ones you socialize with. Those will be the ones that influence you and kind of help you or hinder you in making the right choice. But it says here, people with immoral principles and negative character as friends can influence you to make choices that you could regret for the rest of your life. And if you make a choice, as we've covered before, that leads to you going to jail, you'll find out very quickly. Those friends, they leave pretty quickly. They don't hang around if you make the wrong choice. But once again, avoid meeting someone and immediately deciding to accept this person as a friend. And looking over to page 63, you see the 4 steps to deciding to be friends. And a lot of people say, this is very detailed. Well, if you go through this, you can pretty much guarantee you won't end up in a really bad situation to where I would have had a observation stage and an introductory stage and a getting to know you stage and then a deciding stage. I never got past stage 1. I ended up in jail. Now I've got 30 years to life in prison. And then continuing over, barriers to forming friendships. Go over that again with your students, just rehearsing it, making sure it's refreshed in their mind, because when we say here, remember a friend is someone who respects you and allows you to be an individual, well, we just read that, and that's where we pulled it from. We're just restating it again. But it says here on page 145, they help you to achieve your goals and support and encourage your positive morals. Well, once again, here on page 65, notice there's barriers to forming friendships. And it says in the very top of the page, as you grow and mature, and on page 65, barriers to forming friendships, as you grow and mature, you will have more interactions with others and greater opportunities to choose friends. Now, that's still going through that observation stage and so forth, the 4 stages to forming friends. By now, you have most likely experienced some disappointments in making friends. And I would say that all of us experience that throughout our life. The truth is, finding positive friends can be a matter of trial and error. Sometimes you'll have to face a few obstacles or barriers, but by accepting that these barriers exist and dealing with them in an appropriate way, well, how do you do that? Well, you consider your thoughts, you use self-control, and then you act with making the right choice. Well, you can make positive friends and be a positive friend to others. And once again, when friendships don't work, dealing with rejection. And notice here, we'll read the first 2 sentences. It says, as hard as you might try, the person you want to be friends with might not want to be friends with you. Now, does that mean that the person says, you want to be my friend? No, I don't want to be friends with you. It could be that you want to be friends with somebody if they'll stop doing drugs. It could be, I would like to be your friend if you'll quit bringing alcohol every time we go to the mall, or every time we go out, you'll stop bringing alcohol because we're underage. The rejection could be that you're wanting to be a friend to somebody, but they won't stop the negative character in their life. And that's a rejection also. Sometimes we cloud our minds with thinking that it's just someone saying, no, I don't want to be your friend. But we're talking about rejection through choices also. Because if you're wanting to be a friend with someone and they're making some very negative choices, and you tell them, hey, I don't want to be around somebody that's doing the wrong thing, that's rejection, because they have chosen to go the other way. And that doesn't help anyone. So remember that it's more than just someone, we kind of think, boy and girlfriend in school, they broke up, he rejected her, she rejected him. It's so much more than that. Rejection from making the wrong choice is also rejection. But once again here, notice it says accepting that your personalities are not compatible or that the other person is not interested in your friendship can be pretty hard to deal with. And it can be very hard to deal with if you're really trying to help them. If you're trying to prevent them from doing something that will cause them to stumble, to fall, to get hurt, to do something that will affect them the rest of their lives. That can be a hard thing to sit back and watch. But if you grow old enough, you don't have to be very old, eventually you're going to see people do that. We could do that. Very easily, we could do that. Sometimes a true friend will tell you things that will upset, you'll get upset over it. But it doesn't mean what they told you is wrong. It could be they identified something in you that you already knew was wrong, then now you got to face it, because now you know everybody else knows it's wrong, and they see it in you. And that's what a true friend does. A true friend doesn't, come up, well, I know you're, doing drugs, so I tell you what, finish doing your drugs and we'll go out tomorrow. And that's not a true friend. That's not a true friend at all. But going back here to page 145, with the making the right choice, not bringing harm to ourselves, others, not jeopardizing our positive goals, and considering this rejection of someone that doesn't make the right choice, on page 145 in the third paragraph here, it says, sometimes making a right choice means dealing with rejection. And that's what we just talked about. But remember page 117 and remind your students of the agony of failure. You never want to experience it before you say, yeah, that's not great. I remember when I was young, I think it was Wide World of Sports is what they called it. And it always had the guy coming down the ski jump, and they talked about the agony of failure, the agony of defeat. And I remember watching the guy go off and way up in the air, and then he loses control and nothing but tumbling and breaking legs and breaking arms, and it didn't seem like it went too well. And I very seriously doubt anybody was at the top of that hill going, don't do it, man, don't do it. Everybody was probably, do it the best you can. Let it go farther than anybody else. Well, it seems fun until someone dies. And then it did seem worth it anymore. It doesn't seem worth it at all. But the agony of failure here on page 117, notice it says unrealistic goals usually end in failure because they are not well planned. Well, trying to create a friendship with someone who wants to practice negative character and you expect yourself to maintain a positive character is an unrealistic goal. It's not a right choice, and there's no way you can take a positive and a negative, as David was explaining with the car battery. Don't go crossing them over when you link two cars together, or you'll find out very quickly you get a fireworks show. It doesn't work. Notice it says they can leave the individual feeling frustrated. Unrealistic goals that are unattainable could also discourage you from setting other goals. Goals can also be unrealistic if they are set too high. Setting goals of forming friends and making the right choice with people or associates that are doing things that are wrong, setting goals and thinking that you're going to become a better person by socializing and doing the things they're doing, it's like, well, I'm drinking because he's drinking, and I know we're 17, but I know it's wrong and I can quit at any time. That's like the young lady that took the ecstasy pill. I know it's wrong, so I'm only going to take half the pill. Not like my friends, they took the whole pill. And she's the one that died. These goals can be very confusing in the mind of young people. With young people, death is not a real thing. I remember when I was young, I think all of my friends, none of us thought we were going to die. We all thought, you live forever. You can do whatever you want to do. Never got crazy enough to start doing the chemicals, but did a lot of other very goofy stuff that could have cost myself and others their lives. And you think about, when you think about how great has that person been my friend, how great have they been a friend to me, we should really look in the mirror at first and say, how great of a friend have I been to others? And that's where we should examine this making the right choice and how we're influencing others. Because back here on page 145, notice once again where we left off. It says, as devastating as losing a friend might be, it is far more devastating to make a choice that could affect you for life. And the diseases that have already been brought out, once again, I can't encourage you enough. A lot of people will go, that's not true. It's not true. Research it. Look it up. Prove it to yourself what these diseases become. It's everybody thinks that, and I'll use a certain disease to give you an idea. They'll tell you that if you get herpes, we have a medication and you won't have any breakouts. Don't worry, we got you back. If you get it, we'll take care of you. And there's a lot of money made off of giving people this drug. And it pretty much is a sleeping pill for the disease. And like everything else, as I hope everyone has seen with coronavirus, and I hope everybody's watching the news, it's a very smart virus. It changes. It adapts to the changes that we make in the medical industry. The viruses change right along with it. Well, herpes can do the same thing. And when you're giving something a medication, eventually that tolerance level balances to where the virus becomes stronger than the drug that's being given. And it affects the body. And so did the enormous amount of chemicals that you really didn't need in your body. If you hadn't got the disease, you wouldn't have the effects of that either. Well, how can you compare COVID to herpes? They're both viruses. They're both acquired into the body. Two different ways, but they're taken into the body. And of course, we're finding out readily that a friend would help you do something to help you not get the virus. A friend is not someone that, don't worry, we'll go get a shot tomorrow. It'll be okay. Trust me, I've done this before. I haven't had an outbreak in years. That's not a friend. That's an enemy. But once again, if you're rejected for making a right choice, console yourself with the fact that your choice might have saved your life, and your positive example might encourage someone else to make a right choice. Pat yourself on the back and use your skills in healthy interactions to make new friends. Like the author of The Peaceful Solution said one time, he said, there's nothing wrong with patting yourself on the back, but don't break your arm doing it. Don't give yourself an attaboy over everything you do. Make sure that you're doing the right thing before you go patting yourself on the back. Once again, it says, who knows, you might even get your old friends back when they realize how courageous and positive you are. And that's something that I've seen, and something that you can have hope in, is knowing that if your friendships ever break up over people making wrong decisions, if you'll just stay the course, eventually a person gets tired of the effects of making a wrong choice. And they will see it eventually. And you hope they see it before they get very sickly or before they do something that brings injury to themselves. But at least you can live with knowing you didn't play a part of it. And that's what you want to do. We're here on page 146. We have a goals worksheet. And it says, keeping your mind focused on what you want to achieve in life will help you to resist negative influences. Positive long and short-term goals based on moral principles will give your life purpose and direction. And that's what we've been covering thus far. And of course, it's kind of ironic we're listing 3 goals. Let's see, we're on the 9th day of January, so I guess New Year resolutions are out the door. They sounded great on the 31st of December, but now everybody's probably done broke them. And I did look up before class, and I don't know why, because I already knew what the number 1 resolution was going to be in the United States of America. And the number 1 resolution, again, was to lose weight. And they say that diet companies make an enormous amount of money the very beginning of the year. And they really hope that it's substantial, because by the second month, half of their customers have done fallen off the bandwagon. So, realistic goals, losing weight is a realistic goal, but expecting to lose weight and not making a lifestyle change is not very realistic. Same thing with positive and negative character. Wanting to change our character, very realistic goal. Not doing anything to change our lives and how we make decisions and how we conduct ourselves and expect a different result, that's not going to get us anywhere. But you want to have your students, and you're going to have 30 different students. You could have 30 different goals for number 1 and 2 and 3. Of course, have them list their goals. Whenever you do this, you want to try to get them to share their goals, but don't pressure people into doing it, because sometimes people's goals can be have a family, or have a father that doesn't beat me, have a mother that doesn't do something to me. And I only tell you this because of the experiences we've had with dealing with children in public schools. Sometimes children are extremely honest with what their goals are. And it's not something that, sharing that with other people could lead to a lot of bullying. It could lead to a lot of things that would be very immoral. And people treat people very harshly in society just because we feel they're different. And I was reading a study the other day about bullying. And they said usually people bully, they're saying the number one, and this is theorized, supposedly processed as fact in a study, that it's frustration from things that do not work out in their life, so they find someone weaker and they put the energy of that frustration towards someone who's weaker. They just don't fix the problem. They ignore the problem. A goal is dealing with problems could be a great goal, but have them list 3 goals. And then, of course, after that, write what right choices can you make to help you to achieve your goals. Well, obviously, like if I was to say I want to lose weight, going home and eating 5 pieces of chocolate cake and cupcakes and a gallon of ice cream, and, well, that was great, and I'm ready for supper. That's not going to be very beneficial. There's nothing wrong with eating 1 piece of cake, but probably not 5. So you think about these things, and it's just like when someone says, I want to lose weight, and they start starving themselves. That's not beneficial either. There's certain things a person can do that helps them, but doing without food just to try to lose weight, and if that's your only goal, that's your only reason for doing without food, you should probably get some advice from someone. Because starvation, study some people in Ethiopia and Somalia and countries like that. They'll be the first ones to tell you starvation is not a healthy thing, and it's not a desirable thing. And they'd probably trade places with you in a heartbeat. So, always think about how, if you're in a situation, using self-control in all situations is the way you make the right choice. But once again, what right choices can you make to help you achieve your goals? And of course, the example we have here, the goal was develop a healthy lifestyle. And the choices that we have here as an example is enroll in an exercise program and take a class on diet and nutrition. Replace soda, artificial flavors, colors, and processed foods with more natural ones, like real sugar. And I only say that, I don't say that jokingly. I say that because I read an article the other day that was telling how healthy sugar is when taken appropriately. And I remember the author of The Peaceful Solution, who was examining things one time in studies, and he was telling about the benefits of pure cane sugar and how healthy it was. And he even gave an example of this older lady, and you can look this up on the internet, and they asked her, how did you live such a long life? And she contributed it to drinking a Dr. Pepper every day. And I thought, wow, drinking a Dr. Pepper every day helped you? It sent me to the dentist. Did it really send me to the dentist? No, it wasn't just the Dr. Pepper. It was everything else that I was doing along with, well, let me, I don't need Listerine. Let me use Dr. Pepper. It could be poor hygiene that also puts you that way. But we kind of like blaming things for problems, and we searched for it. But it's kind of like blaming the peaceful solution for telling me I'm a bad person. If you hadn't told me that, I would think I'm a great person. Well, it's like saying, well, sugar's destroying my life when, well, there's nothing really wrong with it. Or it's like saying the sun, is causing skin cancer when scientists are coming back and saying, well, that lotion you're putting on right now it's causing skin cancer too. At least that's what we're thinking right now. It's the lotion is part of it. Well, I thought that was supposed to prevent it. Well, a true friend would tell you something that doesn't bring harm to yourself, someone else, or the environment. And that's what we're talking about. Find out what the truth is behind things. Find out what really is beneficial, and then offer that to your friends. Self-control and making the right choice is always going to help everyone. But continuing on here on page 147, let's turn back to procedure 8. And I know we've given some wide and broad examples of this making a right choice, but when you start dealing with classrooms, especially overseas, where you have many, many different ways of doing things, you can go from one state in the United States to another, and just the way they cook food, the way they socialize, things are completely different just in our own country. So when dealing with people from overseas, things can be very different. So don't limit the mind of your students to the examples that you're given. But here on procedure 8, and this is something that you should be able to enjoy with your classroom. And of course, you want to make sure self-control is used. Anytime you have role play, you want to make sure not to let the foolishness come out, the goofidity that can come out. And sometimes people will laugh at things that are very detrimental to society. And it's not really a laughing situation. We're talking about solving problems, not making them. But here in procedure 8, it says, role play. Be prepared when the heat is on. The activity on pages 147 through 150 in their handbooks will acquaint students with real-life situations and practical ways to make right choices when faced with the pressure of negative influences. Allow students to act out each scene, then discuss the questions. Prompt students to realize that there are many ways to achieving a positive outcome. So that's very important. There's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. The most important thing to avoid a choice that could cause harm to anyone. So that's the most important thing, to avoid a choice that could cause harm to anyone. So here we turn over to page 147, and it's be prepared when the heat is on. And it says learning to solve problems, and once again, that's very important. Learning to solve problems. You're not born knowing, none of us are born knowing how to solve problems. We have to learn how to do it. Remember, we've talked about how these character traits are a skill, and we achieve them through practice, practice, practice. Value, imitate, practice. Well, learning to solve problems in a positive moral way is a sign of maturity, not age. Just because a person is 40 or 30 or 60 or 90 doesn't mean they're mature. Age doesn't do it. It's the way they conduct themselves. Now, once again here, to solve problems positively requires evaluating your options and making the right decision. Making a right choice requires, notice, determination and practice. It's always going to take practice because it's a skill we're developing. It's not done overnight. Society wasn't brought down in a very detrimental way in one day, and it will not be fixed in one night. But as we've always told people, you have to take the first step. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And if we never take that first step, then you'll never do something to better society. And that's really what we have all across the face of this world. A peaceful solution teacher is someone that's learning to teach the peaceful solution, applying the peaceful solution as a student themselves, and then learning to teach it. It's someone that they see a realistic goal that we can make a difference. And the numbers are growing of people that are doing this, that are tired of watching people suffer and disease take hold of society and people die from You know, some people never even getting an opportunity outside of the womb and dying. It's just not right. And we see that even going to the Supreme Court, these things are coming back up again. Now notice it says you have set your mind in advance to stand up for what is moral and proper. And remember that comes from page 80 of the character unit if you want to read over that again with your students about setting their mind in advance and how you prepare for those curveballs and pitfalls that we talked about in the character unit, and how you prepare your mind for, things will not always go as planned, so to speak. So once again, if you have set your mind in advance to stand up for what is moral and proper, even if it means standing alone. And as we move forward, you'll remember these comments as quotes as when we get into the, I don't really want to mention what's in the self-control unit yet, but it'll ring a memory bell back in your mind when you hear this about standing alone and when you're by yourself and what self-control is and doing the right thing. When you hear it from the self-control unit, it'll make more sense about how and why self-control is needing to be applied at all times, even if you're by yourself. But by setting your mind in advance and by using the knowledge you have gained, and that's very important. You cannot set your mind in advance to make the right choice if you've never been told how to do it. If you never heard that tree fall, you won't know what it was. So that knowledge, that power, remember, knowledge is power. The knowledge or the power, you have to have that to be able to set your mind in advance. You can't prepare for something you don't know is coming. So by setting our mind in advance, we've gathered this knowledge, we've gained it. You can avoid making choices that could ruin your future and your life. Be prepared to give the right answer based on right choices. And this is something take serious. Don't let it's very difficult sometimes to keep a classroom, in a certain mindset of seriousness, but don't let goofidity get out. Don't let the foolishness kind of spread out, because this is a very serious part. Saving lives and fixing things that are costing people their lives is a very serious thing. Here it says, act out the following skit as a means of practicing making the right choice. And of course, here's role play 1. And it says, I'm going to call her Eltha here, was walking home from school when Jeremy approached her and tried influencing her using sexual innuendos. Hey girl, what's up? Where you going, sweet thing? Now imagine someone telling someone that, 2 people, side street, no one else around. And the young lady says, I'm going home. Well, do you want to take a detour to my house? My parents won't be home until 8. For what? Now imagine, this is probably someone that's never had anyone make advances, a young person, not a clue. So we can get to know each other better. Well, here you have to answer the following questions. Identify the problem. Well, what was the problem? Notice it says the problem is that she would be alone with someone of the opposite sex and she is being sexually harassed. That should be more obvious today than any other time, because sexual harassment is so prevalent in society and you see it on the news every day. But there are young people that have been raised with morals that would not actually understand that someone is making a sexual advance towards them. You can get to know each other at school in a classroom. You can get to know each other, with chaperones around also. You don't have to get to know each other, somewhere hiding in the bushes or at home when your parents aren't home. Notice it says list a negative choice Eltha can make and the consequences. Notice it says she could agree to go home with Jeremy. He could rape her. She could become pregnant or get an STD. And some people would go, whoa, that's strong words there. Well, what else were they going to do? Honestly, think about it. Admit to what society has become, and honestly, what were they going to do? Well, I don't know that takes place. We're lying to ourselves. It takes place every day in society. In fact, in today's society, they don't even ask them to come home. They find a place at school and they do it to them at school. So let's be honest with ourselves when we do this. And be mindful, though, when you're doing this, you could be talking to a classroom where you could have a young lady that has experienced this and is suffering from it in a very hard mental type of way. Well, here the third part, it says, suggest 2 positive moral choices that she could have made. Notice it says she could walk away without making a reply. Very proper to walk away from someone who's saying something negative to you. You know, it's not an authority figure. It's not a parent. It's not a guardian. It's someone that is enticing her to do something that is wrong. She could just walk away. She could also tell Jeremy to stop sexually harassing her and walk away. These days, it would be threaten him with a lawsuit and then walk away, because that's what takes place today. And, you know, you think about where they say that women don't speak up enough, but then you see in the news, it can be very confusing. This woman says she was harassed, this man's going to be charged, and then the prosecutor comes out and says, we didn't see enough evidence to charge him. We're not going to do anything. So you kind of feel, and it could be a man or a woman, it's not limited to any gender, but you see there's kind of no equal balance there to help stop these situations. Well, how do you stop it? Start teaching people to stop making sexual innuendos. Stop doing the things that bring harm to someone else. You know, do the right thing. We're going to stop here on page 148. So on page 148, we'll start back with role play 2, getting into more of these role plays, and of course giving some more examples of what's going on in society and how it's being very detrimental to what's taking place. So our next class will be 112 at 5:30, and William will be our next teacher. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you then.